Hi everyone, my name is Leanne and today I'm going to be wrapping up all of the books that I read in October. So I read 8 books in October. It was a really great reading month. I didn't read all of the spooky seasonal books that I was planning on reading, but there were some other spooky seasonal books that I ended up reading instead. Overall, it was just a really positive reading month. I feel like I end up really enjoying my reading in like the final quarter of the year. So I have high hopes for my reading in November and December. Anyways, let's get into reviewing the books. And I'm gonna start with the one and only nonfiction book that I read in October. Hopefully I will be reading some more nonfiction in Nonfiction November, but in October there was just the one. I of course read The Woman in Me by Britney Spears. I was so lucky and I was able to go to the launch for this book. I managed to get a ticket through my work. The launch was just amazing. Like obviously it wasn't like a typical book launch. It was so much fun. It was in Mrs. Riot in Covent Garden. There were drag performers, burlesque performers, there was a Britney quiz, there was cupcakes, there was amazing pizza. The drag queens were amazing. The burlesque dancer was amazing. And at midnight, the book was carried in a glass case before we all received a copy of the book, as well as some like Britney goodies. I started reading this immediately on the tube on the way home and then stayed up to finish it when I got home. But I felt so special. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm reading this book just after midnight and no one else has it. Isn't that so special? So I'm a really big Britney fan. Like I'm not as kind of well versed in kind of like her life and her entire like back catalogue of music as I am with say like someone like Taylor Swift, but I am a huge Britney fan. I loved Britney from like as early as my memories go back. Like I really distinctly remember being super young and being like, I want to be Britney Spears when I grow up. I love pop music and she is just such an icon of pop music. And over the past few years following her life in her conservatorship, it's been like really difficult watching her go through that experience. And in this book, she opens up about exactly the details of what went on in that, all of the restrictions and control that was put on her life. And honestly, that was just so heartbreaking to read about. And it was also really difficult to read about how she was treated when she was much younger, her childhood and her family life, how intense the pressure that was put on her from a very young child was, her early years of fame and the gross misogyny that was fired her way. One of the major things that people are talking about when reacting to this book is her relationship with Justin Timberlake and the abortion that she had during that relationship. I think the ghostwriter has done an amazing job at kind of picking up her turn of phrase, and this feels very authentic to how she would tell this story. It does really feel like the ghostwriter has captured her voice. I think I just found this book so heartbreaking to read, and how difficult her life was and the lack of control that she had around her life, the double standards that she faced when compared to not only her male peers but her female peers as well. Like, I think any woman in media creative industries, particularly at this time, would have experienced misogyny, but it feels like there was a whole other layer on Britney. I do just feel like Britney Spears is such a sweet girl, such a sweet woman, that the music industry and the media just completely failed. I think my overwhelming feeling when I finished this book was just a sense of hope that this woman gets to live in peace and happiness and just gets to enjoy her life. I feel like if you want to read this, you probably like have already picked it up or you're already intending to read it. Like I don't feel like there's anything I can do to convince someone to read this. Like if you're not interested, you're not interested. But if you're a Britney fan, you'll want to read this. So one of the unexpected books that ended up on my seasonal TBR was The Pumpkin Spice Cathy by Laurie Gilmore. I mean, this book is totally marketed as like for fans of Gilmore Girls. I mean, Laurie Gilmore, come on. So this is set in a small town called Dreams Harbor. It is basically like Stars Hollow in the Gilmore Girls. And we are following Jeannie, who has been gifted a cafe from her aunt. So her aunt has run this cafe called the Pumpkin Spice Cafe. She has gifted it to Jeannie and it is now Jeannie's responsibility to run this cafe, which is not something she's ever done before. She doesn't have any experience in it. She's just kind of winging it. She then meets Logan, who is a local farmer, and he's basically kind of like the Luke character in Gilmore Girls. So he's the local farmer, he's pretty grumpy, like this is very much Grumpy Sunshine vibes. He completely avoids the town's gossip, and we find out later in the book his reasons for really wanting to avoid being the subject of gossip in this small town. And immediately Jeannie and Logan are drawn to each other. It doesn't take them very long to express their interest in each other. I think this was a cute enough read with its steamy moments, but it's certainly nowhere near the best romance book that I've read this year. It kind of fulfilled the quota of being a cute, cozy autumnal romance, but I think the characters in this book felt super generic. Like they felt like stock characters. I don't think I've really connected to the chemistry or the relationship between the two main leads. So much of the messaging around this book is like for the people that just wish that Lorelai and Luke get it together in the Gilmore Girls. And while I respect it took way too long for them to get together, I think this book just goes completely like the other way. I think the thing that we love so much about the relationship between Lorelai and Luke in Gilmore Girls is the fact that it has this gorgeous foundation in friendship where they have become so compatible and supportive of each other over time. And this was just so instantaneous for me that it felt like their relationship went really, really quickly. Like it felt like even when they were keeping their relationship a secret because they didn't want it to become a subject of the town gossip, I was just thinking like, how are you guys already treating each other like you're in a relationship? Like it just felt like it went really fast for me. I feel like the author didn't properly build up the type of chemistry that we see in the Gilmore Girls. And I do keep bringing that up because that's basically what this book is. Like she's just basically writing like Gilmore Girls fan fiction. Like that's what I feel like this is. Like the exact details of the characters' lives are not the same, but it's going for completely that vibe. I feel like it's just been decided that these two characters are compatible without actually showing us any of that chemistry. Like they're just attracted to each other and that's it. It doesn't have any of the like funny quippiness that the Gilmore Girls has. So I enjoyed this. I would recommend it for kind of cozy autumn reads, but not a favorite for me. The sun has only just decided to come out. Like it's just so much brighter now. Not only did I read a cozy seasonal romance, but I also read a spooky seasonal romance. I read My Roommate is a Vampire by Jenna Levine. This book was so much fun. So this does have the kind of humor that I was really craving from a cozy romance. And the chemistry between these two characters, I really bought. Like it was really authentic, and it meant when it got to those steamy scenes, I was really like rooting for these two characters. And this is just unlike any other book that I've ever read, any other romance book. So this is about Cathy, who really needs a place to live. She is basically broke. She is like a struggling artist, and she sees this apartment advertised for like ridiculously cheap, and she is like, what is the catch here? So she goes and views the apartment, and the guy is like pretty weird. He has an unusual schedule where he like sleeps during the day and is most active at night. He seems like very, very traditional. Like all of the decor in his house is super old. He has this very kind of old-timey way about him. And what she doesn't realize at that time, but we know, is that he is a vampire. So he has been kind of like asleep for like hundreds of years and is now trying to find his way in like the modern world. And he just has no clue about so many modern things, and that just makes him seem like even more weird to Cassie. And there is so much humor in the way that he just doesn't really understand things. I think the best way I can describe this book is that it's just silly, but silly in the best way. Like silly in the way that it is kind of super like self-aware of how strange it is, how weird it is. Frederick the vampire is just such a funny character. There are frequent sections in this book which are Frederick and Cassie exchanging notes like on their kitchen counter, and they are just so funny to read. It was such a quirky book and I enjoyed it so much. I'm gonna stay with adult fiction, and I've read another book that was unlike anything I'd ever read before and is really unlike anything that I kind of typically read. So I read Death of a Bookseller by Alice Slater, and I thought this was brilliant. I was really on the fence about whether I was going to like this or not because it is so different compared to other stuff I read, and it is centered around a bookshop that is basically like Waterstones. And sometimes when books are kind of set in the bookish publishing industry, I can just find them a little bit like too close to home. But I think Alice Slater has done an incredible job with this because she did used to be a Waterstones bookseller. I think a lot of the kind of kind of like more cozy bookshop books are often written by people kind of just imagining what it's like to be in the book industry, whereas Alice has that like frontline experience of being a Waterstones bookseller and kind of knows so much about that element of the book industry. But this is very much like a thriller. We are following two perspectives. Roach, who is a bit of a loner, they don't really take care of themselves too much. They are really, really into true crime, and the inner workings of her mind is like really quite dark. And Roach has been working at that branch of the bookstore for years, but they don't really like it. They don't really like interacting with the customers. They don't really like recommending books or like any of the things you need to be good at to be a good bookseller. When Laura joins the bookshop, Roach becomes fascinated by Laura. Laura is a poet, and a lot of her poetry is inspired by the victims of serial killers and focusing on the victims rather than giving glorification or attention to the details of the criminal and their crimes. And when Roach sees Laura perform her poetry, Roach becomes even more fascinated by Laura in a way that immediately Laura sees this as a red flag. Like, she is not interested in someone who is fascinated by the gruesome, grotesque, dark elements of serial killing. And she has a very personal experience as to why she feels that way, and is just completely repulsed by Roach and their fascination. And this fascination and obsession just gets deeper and deeper as the novel progresses, and you have no idea like where these two characters are going to end up and how far things are going to be taken. I thought this was super page turning. I found both characters really interesting. Like, neither of them are particularly likable characters, but for very, I guess, different reasons. And neither of them have lifestyles that I think I would have ever wanted for myself. Like, they both live very different lifestyles to myself, so I just felt like I was really interested in learning more about them as people. I think because I wasn't sure how I was going to react to this book, it's been a really pleasant surprise how much I enjoyed it. I do think whenever I pick up a book that has a more kind of thriller element to it, I do end up really enjoying it. So if you have any recommendations for books that might be similar to this, I'd love to hear your recommendation down in the comments. The book that I read on Halloween night itself was Poems Bewitched and Haunted, which is part of the Everyman's Library Pocket Poets collection. So they put together these really cute collections of poetry on different themes. And a lot of the poetry included in this was really kind of classic poetry. There was also extracts from Shakespeare's plays in here. It was very much all classical poetry. Some of it I'd come across before, some of it from poets that I'd come across before, but a lot of it was kind of new to me. And to be honest, not particularly to my tastes of poetry. I certainly prefer kind of contemporary poetry with a lot of emphasis on sound effect and rhyme and rhythm, rather than poetry that is really focused on structure and form. And that's what a lot of what was included in this was. It was divided up into different sections around what kind of supernatural figure we were talking about. So there was kind of a section on witches and a section on ghosts. And I thought it was a really fun read for kind of what I wanted it for, which was just to read something kind of Halloween-y on the night. And there was something about reading this like in the dark by candlelight, getting really cozy on a spooky evening, that was really fitting. I kind of enjoyed the aesthetic and the vibe of reading this more than I necessarily enjoyed the content. And if I'm being completely honest, the reason I originally bought this was kind of for like bookish decor for Halloween. Like, I'm just gonna be honest, books as decoration I think is great. Another classic book that I read in October was Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. Okay, so what to say about this book? I don't feel like I need to set up the story too much. I feel like Peter Pan is one of those stories that has been kind of just absorbed into public consciousness, whether that be from various retellings or the Disney film. We kind of know the gist of the Peter Pan story, but what is in the actual novel is much darker than the Disney version. And I do want to preface everything that I say about this book with the fact that there is some really not okay depictions of racial difference in this book. There are passages in this book that are racist, and it makes for really uncomfortable, shocking, just unpleasant reading. Aspects of this novel that I thought were interesting was its whole exploration of growing up and childhood. So a lot of classic novels that I've read and really enjoyed do have some kind of exploration of childhood. Like Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is one of my favorite books of all time. I've also really enjoyed other books that explore childhood, like The Water Babies, like What Maisie Knew. Like, I find this idea of society's and culture's evolving understanding of what childhood is really interesting. And I do think Peter Pan is really interesting in that dialogue and in that progression of our understanding of childhood, in its exploration of unpicking whether it is a positive thing or not to grow up. So I found it really interesting contextualizing it with other books that I've read that look at that topic. I do also think there were elements of this book that were very funny. There were some turns of phrase that were really humorous, and I think that is the spirit of this book that is captured in retellings. And on that note, I did read a Peter Pan and Wendy inspired story, and that was a contemporary young adult kind of urban fantasy novel, Lost in the Neverwoods by Aidan Thomas. So this took a lot of the elements of Peter Pan that I found really interesting. So like I said, exploring that idea of whether it is a positive or a negative to grow up, the dynamic between Peter and Wendy, the idea of this magical place that you can go to and never grow up. Like a lot of things about the spirit of the original novel that I think people are drawn to is brought over to this book. There is no Tinkerbell character though, and I love Tinkerbell, so that's a little bit disappointing, but I actually don't know how she would be incorporated into the book. Like she's not really that relevant to what's happening in this book. So 5 years ago, Wendy and her two younger brothers disappeared in the woods, and it is only Wendy that ends up returning, and she has absolutely no memory of what's happened. She doesn't know where she went in the time that she was missing. She doesn't know anything about where her brothers are. And it's been this really traumatic event in her life, and she's just trying to get on with her life. Dealing with the fact that she can't remember things that had happened to her, the grief of not knowing whether her brothers are alive. And as she's trying to hold her life together, more children start disappearing. And Wendy begins to realize that maybe there is a connection between these more recent disappearances and what happened to her and her brothers. It is then that she meets someone called Peter who needs her help. And together they go on this journey of trying to figure out what is going on and what is going on with these missing kids. I really enjoyed this book. I think Aidan Thomas is a writer that I just want to read more and more from. I have another one of Aidan Thomas's books on my shelf. When you find out the truth about what is going on, oh my god, it is so tough to read about. And the revelations about what has been going on with these missing kids, with Wendy's brothers, has elements of the explanation that are magical and fantastical and supernatural, but there are also elements that are real world tragedy. I didn't love like the romance element between Peter and Wendy. I found that a little bit strange, but other than that, I thought this was a great book. As I said, definitely keen to read more from Aidan Thomas, and I was glad that I was able to read this alongside the original book and enjoy kind of the spirit of the dynamic between Wendy and Peter and Neverland and all that kind of stuff. And the final book I'm going to talk about is published by the place that I work, and that is Thieves Gambit by Cathy Lewis. Look at those amazing red sprayed edges. I love them. So I feel like this book is so different to a lot of the YA that's out there at the minute. This is about Rosalind Quest, who comes from this family of thieves. They are like legendary in like the thieving crime world, but Rosalind has plans to leave this life behind her. She doesn't want to be a thief anymore. But when her mother is kidnapped, her life hangs in the balance. It is then that she is invited to compete in the Thieves Gambit. And this is an international competition to crown the world's greatest thief. The prize for being crowned the world's greatest thief is anything you want. And Rosalind would like the return of her mother. As I said, I think this book is just so different to other YA that is out there. I mean, I can't really think of any other YA books that are centered around like heists. I think if you enjoyed The Hunger Games, you would really enjoy this because it has like these different kind of tasks, setups. All of the people that are competing in this are like incredibly skilled, have different kind of niche specific skills that they have as well. But there's also this sense of like the organizers are puppeteering like you have with The Hunger Games. So it's kind of like The Hunger Games meets Ocean's 11 with all of the heist stuff. And I'm not going to spoil the plot twist at the end, but there's a plot twist at the end. So that is it. They are all of the books that I read in October. If you've read any of these, do leave me a comment down below and let me know what you thought of them. Or let me know what the best book you read in October was. If you want to let me know you're here but you don't have anything specific to say, leave me like a diamond emoji in honor of Thieves Gambit. That's all I'm going to talk about today. I hope you guys are doing well, and I will speak to you in my next video.